There are 4 parts to an interactive listening set of questions. You have the scenario, listen and complete questions, listen and respond questions, and finally summarize the conversation, which is what we are going to cover in this lesson. For information about the first 3 parts, you should check out our other lesson, which you can find up here. You have 6.5 minutes for the first 3 parts. Then you have 75 seconds for summarize the conversation. So summarize the conversation has its own timer. It looks like this. So once you finish the conversation and the listen and complete and listen and respond questions, you then proceed to this question. And it's very simple. You have 75 seconds to write a summary of the conversation. The first key tip for summarize the conversation is before you proceed to the summarize the conversation question, you need to save 30 seconds in the first 6.5 minutes to re-listen to the scenario and review the conversation and the listen and complete questions. That way, you have all of the information that you need fresh in your mind in order to do well on the summarize the conversation question. So the strategy for summarize the conversation is as follows. Reread the scenario and conversation and answer these questions. Who was in the conversation? Why did we talk? What did we talk about? And what are 2 new pieces of information revealed during the conversation? If you can answer these 4 questions while you are reviewing the scenario in the conversation, you have all the information you need to write a very high-scoring summary of the conversation. And here is a template, sentence-by-sentence template that you can use for your summary. Sentence number 1. In this conversation, I talked with whoever you talked with about whatever you talked about. Sentence number 2, you are going to describe something that was revealed during the conversation, that first new piece of information that you identified. In sentence number 3, you are going to describe the second new piece of information that you found in the conversation. Okay, so 3 sentences, very straightforward. Your summary does not have to be sophisticated. In fact, it can't be. You only have 75 seconds. And in any case, a summary is a short version. You have to leave out a lot of details in a summary. So you only need a few bits of key information from the conversation and scenario in order to write a very effective summary in 75 seconds. So this is really all your summary needs to consist of, these 3 sentences with this information. Let's now go through an example. We're going to use the same example that we used in the other interactive listening lesson on the scenario, listen and complete, and listen and respond. So the scenario is, you are a student in the public service department at your university. You have been invited to interview for a few jobs, and you want to make sure that you are prepared. You go to your professor, who has years of experience in the public service sector, and ask for advice on how to prepare for interviews. So let's now write sentence number 1 of our template. So in sentence number 1, we talk about who I talked to and what we talked about / why we talked. So in this conversation, I talked with my professor about how to prepare for job interviews because he has years of experience in the field. So notice how the information I need for sentence number 1 is contained in the scenario. So for sentence number 1, look to the scenario to figure out who you talked to, what you talked about / why you talked to them. Key tip number 2, use the past tense. So notice how in my summary, I am using the past tense. The conversation already happened. I talked with my professor. Okay? Always use the past tense in your summary. And here is the full conversation from which we are going to pull 2 new pieces of information that are revealed during the conversation, which we will use for sentences number 2 and 3. So the conversation starts with me saying, "Professor, I wanted to get your advice about something." Professor says, "Of course. What is it?" "I've been invited to a few job interviews, and I wanted to know if you have any tips on how to prepare for them." "Let's see. First of all, you should make sure that you are familiar with the mission and the values of the organization. They will likely ask you questions about how your experience and skills align with those." "Okay, that makes sense. What else?" "They might also ask you behavioral questions about how you would handle certain situations. It would be helpful to have some examples of times when you've handled similar situations in the past." "All right, that's helpful. What about the dress code? Should I dress formally or is business casual okay?" For most public service organizations, business casual is usually fine unless they specify otherwise in the invitation. You want to look professional, but also approachable, and like someone they would want to work with on a daily basis. "That makes sense. Thanks for your help, Professor." And that's the whole conversation. So let's now find 2 new pieces of information revealed in the conversation. First, we have, you should make sure that you are familiar with the mission and the values of the organization. They will likely ask you questions about how your experience and skills align with those. In other words, this is something that you learned from the other person in the conversation. New information that you didn't know before. Can you find a second bit of information? They might also ask you behavioral questions about how you would handle certain situations. It would be helpful to have some examples of times when you've handled similar situations in the past. And there you go. We have our 2 pieces of information. We have sentence number 2 and sentence number 3. But you can see down below, we have a third bit of information that we could use about how to dress for the interview. Again, a summary requires that you leave out certain information. You don't have to cover everything. You can't cover everything in order to have an effective summary. You have to pick a few bits of information to include. Using the information we identified, we can write our second sentence. My professor recommended that I become familiar with the mission and the values of the organization because they will likely ask me questions about how my experience and skills align with those. And sentence number 3. He also said that I should have examples of how I've handled certain situations so that I can be prepared for behavioral questions. And putting it all together, here is my full answer. In this conversation, I talked with my professor about how to prepare for job interviews because he has years of experience in the field. My professor recommended that I become familiar with the mission and the values of the organization. He also said that I should have examples of how I've handled certain situations so that I can be prepared for behavioral questions. Now, this is a very high-scoring summary. It's well written, there are no spelling or grammar mistakes, and it contains a lot of ideas. So a common question that I get from many students is, "But teacher, I can't write that much. So what do I do?" Then just write 2 sentences. For example, you could just write this, and this would still score quite highly. In this conversation, I talked with my professor about how to prepare for job interviews because he has years of experience in the field. He shared several pieces of advice. For example, that I become familiar with the mission and the values of the organization. So although I only mention one specific bit of information here, that I become familiar with the mission and values of the organization, I do mention that he shared more pieces of advice, right? He shared several pieces of advice, and then I give an example. And this is still an effective summary. Not as effective as the first one, the longer one that we looked at, but this is still good. So something you will have to figure out is how many words you can realistically write in 75 seconds. If you can only write 2 sentences, then practice doing that. But I would recommend that you always start with that first sentence in this conversation. I talked with whoever you talked with about whatever you talked about. That's the most important information for the summary, and it's also the easiest to get because it is in the scenario. Then, if you have time, you should mention specific pieces of information that are revealed during the conversation and add details around those pieces of new information. So, for example, right, why your professor made a certain recommendation, right? That would be an important detail that you could include if you can type and write fast enough. All right. So you need to adapt this strategy based on how quickly you can type and your target score. If you're aiming for 130 or above, then really you should be writing the first version, the long version of the summary. If you only need 110, then this short version will be perfectly fine. All right, I'm now going to cover useful vocabulary that you should learn for Summarize the Conversation. So this is vocabulary that will help you to effectively summarize the conversation and capture those main ideas. So talked with, about, again, that's the vocab you need for that first sentence. For example, I talked with my professor about how to prepare for job interviews. Asked. I asked my classmate for advice on how to study. So the examples here come from different Summarize the Conversation examples, to be clear, right? But often you will ask questions to your professor, to your classmate, whoever you are talking to. And notice how I'm using the past tense here. Recommended. My professor recommended that I study my lecture notes. Often in the conversation, your professor or whoever you're talking to will give you advice or make recommendations. Advise. Advise is a synonym for recommended. My professor advised me to look into the strengths and weaknesses of different graduate programs. Notice here, advise is spelled with an S, which makes it a verb. Advice with a C, which we will look at later, is a noun. All right, so advise, advised, that's the verb. Shared. My professor shared some ideas with me. Made a plan. My lab mate and I made a plan to meet up later in the week to create our report. So often in interactive listening questions, you are talking with a classmate with whom you're working on a group project or something like that, and you're making a plan for how you are going to work together. So made a plan is often very useful. Debated. My partner and I debated how we should divide up the work. So debated is a synonym for discussed. Decided. I decided to apply for both graduate school and jobs. So often in interactive listening questions, at the end of the conversation, you will say that you have reached some decision or that you have decided to do something based on the advice or recommendations of the other person. Considered. This means to think about. For example, my classmate and I considered creating a slideshow, but instead we decided to create a podcast. You can see how you can combine this vocabulary in one sentence to have very powerful, clear, high-scoring sentences that are using advanced vocabulary. Explained. My professor explained that I should wear business casual attire to the interviews. For example, my professor recommended several things, for example, going to a review session. Because I went to my professor because I wanted advice on how to prepare for the exam. So because shows why something happened, which makes it useful when you're talking about why you talked to somebody. So that my lab mate and I decided to meet later in the week so that we could have time to do research. So that is a nice way to express why something is happening. So in that way, it is similar to because. And finally, we have advice with a C, the noun. My professor shared several helpful pieces of advice. Notice here, I don't have advices because advices does not exist in English. It is not a word. Instead, I have to say pieces of advice. So don't say advices. Avoid that very common mistake. All right, let's recap what we covered in this lesson quickly so that you can easily remember the main points. Save about 30 seconds to review the scenario and the conversation before going to summarize the conversation question. This is key. Use the past tense in your summary and use this template. In sentence number 1, I talked with whoever you talked with about whatever you talked about. That information you can find in the scenario, which is why you want to review that before you go to summarize the conversation question. Sentence number 2, discuss the first piece of new information revealed in the conversation that you find. And sentence number 3, a second piece of new information that you find in the conversation. So that's it. 3 sentences. It should be pretty straightforward. Again, because you only have 75 seconds, you don't have time to write a complex summary of the conversation. You can only highlight the main points. All right, from here, I would recommend that you check out this other very popular video on a useful template that students around the world have used to get a great score on the DET. Also, if you want to practice interactive listening, which you absolutely should, just click the link down in the description to create your free Arno account and get unlimited practice questions for every question type for free, including the new interactive listening question format. All right, I'll see you over in the next lesson.